Some invitations don't invite you to an event, they invite you into a trap you don't recognize yet. The envelope arrived at the penthouse of Jason Whitmore on a quiet Manhattan morning, placed perfectly on his marble kitchen counter as if it had always belonged there. No sender name. No corporate logo. Only a gold-embossed seal that read, Royal Gala of Sovereign Arts. Hassan stared at it for a moment, then let a slow smile form on his face. In his world, silence like this always meant exclusivity. Recognition. Power acknowledging power. He turned it in his hands once, already imagining the cameras, the elite crowd, the conversations that would confirm what he believed he had become. Behind him, the city stretched across glass windows like a living empire he had climbed step by step. When Brianna Cole entered the room later that morning, her heels clicking softly against the floor, she didn't need to ask what it was. Hassan simply held up the envelope like a trophy he had not yet earned but already claimed. They finally see it, he said calmly. This isn't just another gala. This is the Royal Gala. Brianna smiled, though something in her eyes lingered a fraction longer than comfort allowed. Hassan didn't notice. It never did when certainty began to replace awareness. By afternoon, preparations had already started. His tailored suit was chosen, his watch polished, his presence carefully constructed like every public appearance before it. To him, this was not an invitation, it was confirmation of status. A final seal on a narrative he believed was still moving upward. What Jason didn't know was that across the same city, systems he had never seen were already aligning around that same event. Conversations behind closed doors. Names reviewed without explanation. Access granted without visible authority. The Royal Gala was not being prepared for guests. It was being prepared for structure. And somewhere within that structure, a name he had long stopped considering was already embedded into its foundation. Alicia Carter. Hassan leaned back as the skyline shifted into evening light, his reflection merging with the city beyond the glass. He raised his glass slightly in a quiet toast to himself, unaware that the invitation resting on his counter was not a celebration of his arrival, but a countdown to the moment everything he believed about arrival would quietly end. The evening air in Manhattan felt unusually still, as if the city itself was holding its breath without knowing why. In the penthouse above Fifth Avenue, Jason Whitmore was still preparing for the night ahead, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with the kind of confidence that had become second nature to him. Brianna Cole stood near the mirror, carefully examining her appearance under warm golden light, though her attention kept drifting back to the invitation resting on the table behind them. There was something about it that felt heavier than paper, something that did not match the tone of celebration Jason kept insisting it represented. Jason noticed her hesitation and gave a small reassuring laugh, dismissing it with ease. He had built his entire career on reading rooms, on controlling perception before it could ever shift against him. Tonight, he believed, would be no different. Across the city, preparations for the Royal Gala were already underway in ways the public would never see. Vehicles moved through restricted routes without announcement. Staff members responded to silent confirmations on encrypted systems. Interior floors inside the venue adjusted lighting, seating, and security access without visible instruction. Everything was moving with a precision that suggested coordination far beyond a simple social event. Hassan checked his reflection one final time before leaving the penthouse, satisfied with what he saw. A man arriving at the peak of recognition. A man stepping into validation. Brianna followed beside him, her expression carefully composed, though her silence carried a subtle weight that Jason continued to ignore. As their vehicle pulled into the city traffic, he leaned back into his seat, scrolling through early media mentions of the gala. Names of investors, celebrities, and elite guests appeared across curated articles, reinforcing the belief that he had entered a level of influence few ever reached. Yet none of those names included hers. Alicia Carter remained absent from every visible list, every published mention, every social prediction surrounding the evening. And still, within the unseen structure supporting the event, her presence was not absent at all. It was embedded. Controlled. Active. In a high-rise building several blocks away, Alicia stood in a quiet interior office surrounded by glass and controlled lighting. There was no urgency in her movements, no visible preparation that would suggest anticipation. A tablet rested on the table in front of her, displaying real-time confirmations from multiple departments tied to the Gala structure. Security clearances. Guest sequencing. Protocol alignment. Every system responded to her oversight without delay or question. She did not look at the city with curiosity. She looked at it with recognition, as if observing a design already completed long before tonight. A soft notification appeared on her screen confirming that final guest arrivals had begun. She acknowledged it with a simple, measured pause before setting the device down. Outside, the skyline continued to glow as night fully settled over Manhattan. In the distance, the Royal Gala venue stood illuminated like a crown of light above the river, drawing attention from across the city. Hasson's vehicle approached the entrance, slowing as cameras and guests began to appear in clusters near the grand doors. He straightened slightly, adjusting his posture as he prepared to step into the moment he believed would define him. Brienne glanced at him briefly, then toward the entrance, where something about the atmosphere felt subtly different from what she had expected. The air was too controlled. The silence too intentional. Hasson did not notice. He only saw opportunity. And as the doors of the Royal Gala came into view, neither he nor anyone beside him understood that every step forward was already being measured against a structure they could not see, a structure that had been waiting for him to arrive exactly as he was. The limousine slowed as it approached the grand entrance, where golden light spilled across polished marble steps and rows of silent staff stood perfectly aligned like part of a larger machine. Hasson Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks one final time, his reflection flickering across the tinted glass as the vehicle came to a stop. Outside, flashes from distant cameras already captured arriving guests, each moment curated for public perception, each arrival feeding into the growing myth of the evening. Brienne Cole shifted slightly beside him, her gaze fixed on the entrance, where something about the atmosphere felt less like celebration and more like controlled expectation. Hasson noticed nothing unusual. To him, this was exactly how power felt when it was being acknowledged. The door opened, and the night air carried a quiet intensity that did not match the elegance of the setting. He stepped out first, followed by Brienne, his posture calm, deliberate, confident. Camiras immediately turned toward him, capturing the image he had carefully constructed over years of ambition. A few reporters called out his name, and he responded with a controlled smile, pausing just long enough to ensure recognition. Inside the venue, the Royal Gala revealed itself as a world built entirely from precision. Crystal chandeliers hung like suspended constellations above a crowd of carefully selected guests. Music flowed at a measured tempo, never too loud, never too soft, as if every sound had been calibrated for emotional effect. Jason moved through the entrance with Brienne at his side, absorbing the attention as if it were confirmation of his rise. Conversations around him paused briefly as people noticed his presence, reinforcing the belief he held about his place in the room. Yet beneath that surface recognition, something subtle existed in the environment that he did not register. Staff members moved differently when his name was mentioned, not with excitement, but with quiet acknowledgement. Security personnel exchanged brief, nearly imperceptible signals that redirected movement patterns around certain sections of the hall. Hasson interpreted none of it as significant. He was focused instead on scanning the room for the right connections, the right eyes, the right validation. Brienne leaned slightly closer to him, whispering something about how extraordinary the venue was, but her voice carried a faint hesitation she could not fully conceal. Hasson responded with confidence, telling her that this was exactly where they were meant to be, as if the entire evening had been designed to recognize them. At the center of the hall, a raised platform stood beneath a cascade of soft golden lighting, empty for now but unmistakably important. Hasson's attention drifted toward it briefly, then away, assuming it was reserved for the evening's host or ceremonial announcements. He had no reason to think otherwise. Around him, conversations continued in refined rhythm, glasses clinked softly, and the illusion of effortless prestige filled every corner of the space. But deeper within the structure of the event, invisible confirmations were being exchanged across secure channels, signaling that final protocols were nearing activation. Hassan remained unaware of any of it, continuing to believe that he was moving through a world that still operated on recognition alone, not realizing that recognition was not what this net had been built for. The atmosphere inside the Royal Gala began to subtly change as Jason Whitmore and Brianna Cole moved deeper into the hall, unaware that the rhythm of the evening was no longer simply social but procedural. The conversations around them remained elegant, yet pauses between words grew slightly longer, as if invisible instructions were being followed beneath polite dialogue. Hassan did not notice. He was focused on recognition, scanning the room for familiar names, influential figures, and signals of approval that would reinforce the identity he believed he had built. Brianna, however, felt something shifting in the environment, a quiet recalibration that she could not explain. The lighting across the hall adjusted almost imperceptibly, soft gold tones deepening into a more structured contrast that guided attention toward the central platform. A staff positioned near the perimeter exchanged brief glances, then resumed their movements with synchronized precision. Jason lifted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, taking a slow sip as he continued speaking about potential partnerships and future visibility, his voice calm and confident, as if the night was already validating his success. Then, for a moment, the music softened without announcement. Not stopped, not interrupted, but reduced to a restrained presence that made the silence more noticeable than sound. Conversations across the hall gradually lowered in volume, not through instruction, but through instinctive response to a shift no one had yet named. Hassan finally noticed this change and paused, glancing around with mild curiosity, though still without concern. Brianna leaned slightly closer, whispering that something about the timing felt unusual. Hassan smiled and dismissed it, telling her that elite events often had staged transitions to build anticipation. Yet even as he spoke, the energy of the room continued to tighten, as if the space itself was preparing for recognition of something larger than its guests. At the far end of the hall, doors that had remained closed since arrival were now under quiet observation by staff stationed nearby. A subtle confirmation passed through unseen channels, and the central platform lighting shifted again, becoming more focused, more deliberate. Hassan's attention drifted briefly toward it before returning to the crowd, still assuming it was part of standard ceremony structure. He had attended enough high-level events to recognize controlled presentation when he saw it, or so he believed. But what he was witnessing was not presentation. It was alignment. Across the venue, every layer of activity now seemed to respond to a single unseen timing mechanism. Guests adjusted their posture slightly without realizing why. Conversation slowed, then softened further. Even the ambient sound of the hall felt contained, as if the building itself was holding a breath. Brianna's expression tightened subtly as she looked around again, her earlier confidence replaced with a growing sense that the evening was moving toward something irreversible. Hassan, however, remained anchored in his interpretation of success. He straightened his jacket, readying himself for what he assumed would be a keynote moment or formal acknowledgement of distinguished guests. The central platform. Lights intensified one final degree, and the entire hall reached a level of stillness that felt no longer accidental. It was then that Jason realized the attention of the room was no longer dispersed. It was converging. And for the first time since arriving, he understood that whatever was about to happen was not responding to him at all. The silence inside the Royal Gala deepened further, no longer just an absence of sound but a controlled state of anticipation that seemed to hold the entire hall in place. Hassan Whitmore stood near the center aisle now, his confidence still intact on the surface, yet subtly adjusted by the atmosphere that no longer responded to his presence in the way he expected. Brianna Cole remained beside him, her posture composed but her eyes increasingly scanning the room, noticing how attention was no longer scattered across guests but gradually concentrating toward a single unseen direction. Hassan exhaled lightly, convincing himself this was simply a structured transition before a major announcement, the kind of ceremonial pacing elite events often used to heighten prestige. He straightened his posture again, reclaiming his sense of control, and glanced around the hall with a faint smile, expecting recognition at any moment. At that exact time, the central platform lighting shifted again, becoming sharper and more focused, as if the room itself had narrowed its attention into a single point. Stuff along the perimeter stopped moving for a fraction of a second before resuming in perfect synchronization, a detail so subtle that most guests failed to consciously register it. Jason did not notice that pause, but Brianna did, her expression tightening slightly as she leaned closer to him and whispered that something about the timing felt deliberately structured rather than natural. Hassan responded with calm reassurance, telling her that high-level galas often use dramatic pacing to build anticipation before introducing key figures. Yet even as he spoke, the environment contradicted his explanation in ways he could not fully interpret. The sound of conversation across the hall had now reduced to a near-uniform quietness, not forced but instinctive, as if every guest had unconsciously agreed to wait. Hassan's attention shifted briefly toward the elevated platform again, where the lighting had now stabilized into a precise golden focus, illuminating an empty space that no longer felt temporary but prepared. A faint shift in the audience occurred as several heads subtly turned toward the same direction, not because of instruction but because of awareness spreading through the room like an unspoken signal. Hassan's expression tightened for the first time, a small flicker of uncertainty breaking through his confidence, though he quickly suppressed it. He told himself again that this was simply anticipation, nothing more. Brianna, however, no longer looked convinced. Her gaze moved across the hall, taking in the stillness, the controlled lighting, the absence of casual movement, and the way even staff now stood in positions that felt intentionally aligned. The room no longer felt like a celebration space. It felt like a stage waiting for activation. Hassan adjusted his jacket once more, preparing mentally for what he assumed would be a formal recognition or a keynote introduction. Yet the silence continued to deepen in a way that made every second feel more deliberate than the last. And then, without announcement, without warning, the entire hall reached a level of stillness that no longer resembled anticipation but acknowledgement, as if everyone present had already been informed of something Jason had not been told. His gaze lifted toward the central platform again, and this time he did not look away immediately, because for the first time since arriving, he felt the subtle and unfamiliar sensation that the center of attention was no longer something he could approach, but something that was already moving past him. The silence inside the hall had now fully transformed into something irreversible, a state where every movement felt measured against an unseen authority that no longer required explanation. Hassan Whitmore stood beneath the dim golden edge of the audience lights, his earlier confidence now held in place by habit rather than certainty. Brianna Cole remained close beside him, but her attention was no longer fixed on the crowd in admiration. It was focused on the central platform, where the lighting had stabilized into a precise, almost ceremonial glow that suggested not preparation but confirmation. Hassan noticed the change in atmosphere more clearly now. Conversations had not simply quieted. They had aligned into stillness. The kind of stillness that does not happen by chance. He glanced toward Brianna, attempting a reassuring expression, but she did not respond immediately. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, tracking details he had overlooked. Staff no longer walked in casual motion. They stood in positions that felt deliberate, as if each location had been assigned long before the guests arrived. Hassan inhaled slowly, forcing a calm he still believed he controlled. He told himself again that elite events often created dramatic pauses to heighten importance, that anticipation was part of prestige. Yet even as he formed that thought, the environment contradicted it. The central platform lights brightened slightly, not dramatically, but with intention. A subtle shift moved through the audience, a collective adjustment of attention that no longer required instruction. Brianna leaned closer to Jason and whispered that she had seen events like this before, but never with this level of precision. Her voice carried uncertainty she could not fully suppress. Hassan responded with a quiet nod, though his focus had begun to fracture between confidence and observation. At the far end of the hall, the entry doors remained closed, but a change in the surrounding space suggested imminent transition. Security staff positioned near the perimeter exchanged minimal signals, their movements reduced to controlled efficiency. The room itself felt compressed, as if every layer of noise, motion, and expectation had been filtered down to a single point of readiness. Hassan shifted his stance, suddenly aware that his earlier sense of command over the evening no longer matched the reality unfolding around him. For the first time, he stopped scanning for recognition and began scanning for explanation. Brianna's gaze remained fixed forward, her expression now entirely serious. She no longer looked at Jason for reassurance. She was watching the platform as if expecting something already confirmed. The lighting deepened once more, and the hall entered a level of silence so complete that even small sounds felt exposed. Hassan's confidence did not collapse, but it no longer expanded either. It held, suspended, without reinforcement. Then a subtle auditory cue moved through the space, not loud, not disruptive, but enough to signal that the next phase had begun. Heads across the hall turned in near unison toward the central platform. Hassan followed the motion instinctively. His expression changed slightly, no longer fully composed, as the realization formed that whatever was about to happen was not designed to validate him, but to reveal something beyond his expectation entirely. And in that suspended moment, with every eye aligned toward the same point, Jason understood without being told that he was no longer at the center of attention, but standing inside the perimeter of someone else's. The entire hall remained locked in a suspended silence that felt heavier than sound itself, as every guest's attention converged on the central platform with increasing inevitability. Hassan Whitmore stood rigidly now, no longer adjusting his posture or performing confidence, but instead observing the room with a quiet tension he could not fully suppress. Brienne Cole no longer whispered or shifted beside him. She was completely still, her eyes fixed forward as if she had already understood that the evening was no longer unfolding according to social expectation. The lighting across the royal gala intensified slightly, not in brightness but in focus, narrowing into a precise geometric cone that made the platform appear less like a stage and more like a point of origin. Hassan swallowed slowly, his earlier certainty now replaced by something less defined, a recognition that the structure of the room was responding to something beyond his awareness. A soft, controlled sound moved through the hall, signaling a transition that was not announced in words but in presence. Guests straightened instinctively. Conversations had already ceased, but now even movement felt discouraged by the atmosphere itself. Jason glanced briefly at Brianna, searching for reassurance, but her expression gave none. Instead, she was watching the platform with a level of attention that suggested expectation rather than curiosity. The central doors at the far end of the hall, previously closed and unnoticed, now drew every line of sight without any instruction. The space between those doors and the platform felt charged, as if the entire event had been designed to lead toward this exact moment of stillness. Hassan's thoughts attempted to categorize what he was experiencing as ceremony, protocol, or staged presentation, yet none of those explanations fully held against the weight of the silence. Then, without dramatic announcement, the doors began to open. Not quickly, not forcefully, but with deliberate precision, as if the mechanism itself was synchronized with the room's collective awareness. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Guests did not gasp or speak. They simply adjusted their posture in near unison, a response that felt less emotional and more conditioned. Hassan felt a tightening in his chest that he could not immediately interpret, as his attention locked onto the widening opening. Brianna's breath slowed slightly beside him, her gaze unwavering. The sound in the hall had now diminished to near nothing, yet the absence of noise felt structured rather than empty. It was at that moment that Jason realized something fundamental had shifted in the room's hierarchy of attention. It was no longer distributed among guests, nor centered on status or presence. It was directed, focused, converging. It took a slow step forward without realizing it, then stopped as if the movement itself had been questioned by the environment. The doors were now fully open, revealing only a threshold of light beyond, controlled and balanced, offering no immediate identity to what lay past it. Every guest remained frozen in anticipation, yet the anticipation itself felt different now, no longer about what would happen next, but about what had already been determined. Hassan's earlier confidence did not disappear entirely, but it was no longer supported by the room. It existed in isolation, disconnected from the shared reality unfolding around him. Brienne finally shifted her gaze slightly toward him, her expression no longer uncertain but quietly aware of something he had not yet accepted. And in the center of that perfectly controlled silence, Jason understood for the first time that the evening was not progressing toward recognition, but toward revelation, and that whatever was about to enter the hall had already defined the meaning of everything that came before it. The doors stood fully open now, and the entire royal gala held its breath in a silence so complete it felt engineered rather than natural. Hassan Whitmore remained frozen near the center aisle, his posture still upright but no longer confident in the way it had been only minutes before. Brienne Cole did not move at all. Her eyes were fixed on the opening, where light spilled into the hall in a controlled, almost ceremonial flow that suggested not an entrance, but a confirmation of arrival. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the smallest gestures from the crowd had disappeared, replaced by a collective stillness that felt enforced by presence alone. Hassan tried to interpret what he was seeing as a formal introduction, a high-level guest reveal, or perhaps an honorary presentation, but none of those explanations matched the weight building in the room. Then she appeared. Alicia Carter stepped through the doorway without hesitation, her movement steady and composed, as if she had already been walking through this space long before anyone noticed. There was no rush in her pace, no visible acknowledgement of the audience, only a calm precision that reshaped the atmosphere the moment she crossed the threshold. The lighting above the central platform subtly adjusted, aligning itself with her presence rather than the stage. It was not a spotlight choosing her. It was the room responding to her. Hassan's breath slowed without conscious intent as his eyes locked onto her. For a brief second, his mind resisted recognition, attempting to place her in the category he had erased long ago. Then the realization formed fully, sharp and undeniable. The woman walking into the center of the royal gala was not an attendee. She was the structure behind it. Brianna's expression changed instantly. The composed uncertainty she had carried earlier collapsed into silent understanding as she took a small step back, as if distance could create clarity. Around them, guests who had moments ago represented influence and status now appeared differently, their attention no longer divided but directed entirely toward Alicia. Hassan's earlier confidence fractured into stillness. He watched as Alicia moved toward the central platform, her presence uninterrupted by reaction or acknowledgement from anyone around her. She did not look at Jason. She did not look at Brianna. Her gaze remained forward, focused on the space that had already been prepared for her. Staff along the perimeter adjusted their positions with subtle synchronization, reinforcing the sense that every movement in the room had been designed around her arrival. Hassan felt something shift inside him that he could not immediately name. It was not anger or shock. It was recognition of misalignment, the sudden understanding that his interpretation of the evening had been incomplete from the beginning. Brianna's voice did not come, but her silence beside him felt heavier than any words could have been. Alicia reached the base of the platform and paused only briefly, not for hesitation, but for confirmation. The hall remained perfectly still, every eye now anchored to her without exception. Hassan realized then that no one in the room was waiting for introduction. They were waiting for acknowledgement. And in that moment, as Alicia stepped fully into the center of the royal gala, the truth settled into the space without announcement, without explanation, and without need for validation, that the entire evening had not been built around celebration, but around her. The royal gala had reached a level of silence that felt almost unreal, as if the entire hall had been suspended inside a moment that no one was permitted to interrupt. Alicia Carter stood at the center of the platform, perfectly still, her presence not announced by sound or motion, but by the way every gaze in the room remained fixed on her without resistance. Hassan Whitmore remained frozen near the aisle, his earlier assumptions completely dismantled by what he was witnessing. Brianna Cole stood beside him, no longer reacting outwardly, her expression settled into quiet understanding that the structure of this evening had never belonged to the narrative Jason had constructed in his mind. Alicia did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she finally spoke, her tone carried through the hall with calm precision, not amplified, but naturally heard by everyone present as if the room itself had adjusted to carry her words. She acknowledged the gathering not as guests attending an event, but as participants within a structure that had been defined long before their arrival. There was no introduction of herself in the traditional sense. There was only confirmation of presence. Jason felt a slow internal collapse of interpretation as he listened. Every detail he had observed throughout the evening, from the synchronized staff movements to the controlled lighting shifts, now reassembled into a single realization he could not ignore. This was not a social recognition. It was architectural control. Brianna's attention remained forward, her composure steady, but her silence beside Jason no longer suggested uncertainty. It suggested clarity. Alicia's gaze moved across the hall without focusing on any individual, as if acknowledging the entire space rather than the people within it. She continued speaking in a measured tone, referencing the purpose of the gathering not as celebration, but as alignment. Jason tried to locate himself within this new framework, attempting to reinterpret his presence as still relevant, still acknowledged. But the environment offered no reinforcement for that belief. The central platform, the lighting, the staff positioning, and even the silence itself all confirmed a single hierarchy that did not include him in the way he had assumed. A subtle movement occurred among the guests, not disorder, but recognition of authority. Hassan noticed it and felt a quiet tightening in his thoughts as he realized that no one was looking at him for confirmation anymore. They were looking past him. Brianna finally spoke in a low voice, not to Jason directly, but almost to herself, acknowledging what she now understood without needing explanation. Hassan did not respond. His attention remained locked on Alicia, who stood with complete composure, continuing to speak with calm control that required no validation from the room. The realization that formed within Jason was not immediate collapse, but gradual displacement. It was no longer the focal point of interpretation. It was part of the audience to something far larger than his influence. Alicia concluded her statement without emphasis, allowing silence to return naturally, as if it had always belonged there. And in that silence, the final structure of understanding settled across the hall. Hassan remained standing, but everything he had believed about arrival, status, and recognition had already been quietly rewritten, not through confrontation, but through absolute clarity of presence.